Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This is Dr. Nelson Ogunshaki. I'm really pleased to welcome everybody to this particular webinar, which is working together to combat corruption in the global construction industry. This is a webinar to mark the International Anti-Corruption Day and also to launch the FIDIC State of the World report on corruption. It is a pleasure to be back online. They don't often let me through again to actually host this particular webinar, which is quite important on this special day of uniting the world against corruption. Fantastic gathering. I'm really delighted to host this. The report has just been released this morning. I believe those who need to get it, you can get it on our website, which is the latest State of the World report. We've produced quite a number over the years, and this particular year, this must be our third one. It is the state of the report on corruption, and that is out today. So please download this. I would like to welcome everybody on board from wherever you are. I do believe that we have quite a lot of people registered for this particular webinar, and I hope it should be an interactive and enjoyable one. The report, it is there. There are four main conclusions that came out of that report. You will hear from our esteemed panelists. They will talk about it later on, but I do encourage everybody to please visit the FIDIC website and download. Next, please. So moving on, it is my pleasure to invite FIDIC board member who is responsible as the liaison for our Integrity Management Committee, James Mwangi from Kenya, to share with us an opening remark on behalf of the FIDIC board. So James, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ogunchakin. Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be introducing this special webinar to mark the United Nations International Anti-Corruption Day, and also to launch FIDIC's latest State of the World report on the crucial issue of corruption. Many thanks to the FIDIC Integrity Management Committee for their help in delivering and organizing this webinar. One of FIDIC's key values is that of transparency and integrity. And so it is highly appropriate that we are organizing this webinar to coincide with the United Nations International Anti-Corruption Day, which takes place today. The day is organized every year to raise awareness of corruption and of the role of the UN Convention in combating and preventing it. The global cost of corruption has been estimated to be up to $4 trillion a year, a massive amount which FIDIC condemns in absolute terms. But it is not enough to just condemn corruption. We also need to do all we can to combat it and root it out. Corruption leads to a lack of trust and failed projects, and this damages the construction industry and indeed society as a whole. FIDIC core values of quality, integrity, and sustainability offer a key platform in galvanizing the industry to work together to increase the transparency of infrastructure delivery. This webinar will look at how the global construction and infrastructure industry can collaborate better and unite to combat corruption, and will also launch FIDIC's latest State of the World report on the subject, entitled Corruption, Its Effects, and the Need to Take Action. To combat corruption, we need to continue to expose it, and improving transparency and understanding is a key tool to this battle. Today's webinar and the report we are launching today explores not only the link between corruption and economic activity, but also activity at an industry level, and crucially, what we all need to do collectively to combat it. I look forward to an interesting and insightful discussion. Back to you, Nelson.
Thank you very much, James, for that very warm welcome and opening remarks on behalf of FIDIC President. Let me just, by following that up, to say that a lot of regard from the FIDIC President. Tony Barry, who is not here today, but he did send his regard. And I think his key message to me is that, we always talk about quality, sustainability, and integrity. And as such, this subject today is so critical to what we do within FIDIC, that we stand not only combating or dismissing it, but actually make sure we wage war against it. So, James, thank you very much for your kind word. To move on at the moment, I just want to take a poll of the audience to ask the odd question. And the question is our industry getting better or worse? And when it comes to the combating corruption, are we getting better or worse? Or is it a case that we need to know? So time for you to vote. This is just really to get an opinion of where we are. I thought we should do this as a good icebreaker to get us into the swing of, how the market perceives and how we can actually, check, whether we're making progress or not. Hopefully, at the end of this particular webinar, we will ask another question to check whether we're making progress. So with that being said, it'd be good to get feedback, say, how are we doing? Are we getting better or getting worse? I see 66% said getting better, and then 34% said, not making any progress. So it's getting worse. Well, thank you very much for that feedback. That's always very useful. It is my pleasure now to introduce the panelists. The panelists are, really well chosen. You have Richard Stel, who is Vice President of RS&H and Chair of the FIDIC Integrity Management Committee. And Richard is an outstanding individual. I'm sure you will hear from him in a minute. And that will be followed by Juliana Fox, who is the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer of WSP Global in Canada. She told me she's actually in London right now. That's interesting. Then after Juliana, we have Peter Matthews, who is Executive Director, Infrastructure Transparency Initiative Costing and Engineers Against Poverty. This is an organization I highly respected, and I used to be a part of their board. So Peter, very much. Then goes with my friend, Neil Stanbury. I think we talked about it, been together for over 20 years on this battle. And your word is that we don't give up, even though it may sound sometimes that we are not making progress, but we don't give up. So you got 4 eminent speakers. And with that having said, I'm going to hand over to Richard, who is the chair of the Integrity Management Group, to basically give us an oversight of what the IMC has been doing, and maybe to do a little bit of dive into the report and then give us a kickstart. And so Richard, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Excellent. So Nelson, thank you very much for the opportunity to continue to speak and to advocate for FIDIC on the issue of integrity management and fighting against corruption. As the current chair of the Integrity Management Committee, a position that I've held since January 2021, it's really my pleasure to have an opportunity to explain to everyone what our committee does, how we advocate on behalf of FIDIC, and then to dive into the report. I mean, as you've heard from both from Nelson and from James, integrity management is one of the 3 pillars of FIDIC. It's an initiative I've been involved in within the FIDIC enterprise since 2008. So it's a personal and professional passion project of mine. So let's talk a little bit about our committee and what integrity management, what the IMC, the Integrity Management Committee, does and how we work on behalf of FIDIC and behalf of the global consulting industry. So really, we're chartered with 3 primary strategic objectives. The first one is to promote integrity and to draw the line at zero tolerance for corrupt activity globally, certainly within our industry, within the built infrastructure sector. Secondly, we are involved with the development and promotion of materials and tools that FIDIC uses to advocate for the combating of corruption globally. And then third, we act as an expert resource related to issues of integrity management, integrity development, and again, combating corruption within FIDIC, within the architectural, engineering, and construction sectors, and then certainly globally as we engage other agencies. In order to execute these 3 strategic priorities, there are 5 ways we go about doing that. The first one is through policy. We help to craft and develop policies on behalf of FIDIC in both the combating of corruption and again, integrity management. Secondly, we're involved in training. We work through the FIDIC Academy to develop and to disseminate training materials and modules that can be used to help educate all of you your colleagues, your juniors and superiors as it relates to these important issues. And then again, there are tools that we will go about in developing. These include things such as FIMS, which is the FIDIC Integrity Management System, GPIMS, which is the Global Procurement Integrity Management System, and other tools that we're working on a consistent and regular basis. We also work to communicate the fact that these tools exist, that our committee does exist, and that FIDIC is a powerful advocate and ally in the global fight against corruption. And then finally, we do liaise with other international agencies such as Transparency International, COST, World Federation of Engineering Organizations, and others. And certainly we're working to engage the UN Convention Against Corruption, UN General Assembly, and other global agencies to continue to advocate to get to a point where integrity is such a daily aspect of the way that we go about doing business that we can stamp out corruption in any form within the built infrastructure environment. So as you heard from both Nelson and from James, FIDIC has put out a state of the world report on the issue of combating corruption and really going to the point of how has our sector evolved? How are we successfully managing this? And really, what has the world learned in the last 10 years as it relates to corruption and how to fight it? It's a wonderful document. As you heard from both James and Nelson, please go out to our website. Please download it. Even if you just take a look at the wonderful introduction that Nelson and Tony Berry authored, and look at the executive summary. And what I'd like to do is just give you a flavor of what you'll find when you go into that report. The report does a couple of things. And one of the most important things is really looking at large indicators as to how things are moving forward in the infrastructure sector by looking at three primary drivers: gross domestic product per capita, industry value added per worker, and foreign direct investment in terms of net inflow into a country. And how do these three indicators show if we're making progress against corruption? And how does that relate in terms of economics and whether the economics are improving in a given country? So in summary, the results are positive. They also show us that there is more work to be done. The analysis that you'll find in that report does show that the reduction of corruption in a country does result in an increase in GDP per capita, which is a good finding. Secondly, reducing corruption within the industry of architectural engineering services and the construction sector does also promote and result in a net increase of economic activity. The last item related to foreign direct investment, the results are still a bit mixed. And I say this, that there is a positive relationship that you'll see in the data and in the conclusions that are drawn, where a larger inflow of direct investment does result in a reduction in corruption. The thing is that our findings show that this impact was less than expected. So it does just show us that, again, the work that we're doing, while we have made progress, and it's good to see that 2/3 of us on this presentation today are of the opinion that things are getting better. There's still a lot of ground to cover to get us to a point where there is really a total ban on corruption. We're all working from a position of integrity, and we're delivering and supporting our built infrastructure around the globe from that position. One of the things that's used as a benchmark when we're looking at corruption is the CPI, the Corrupt Perceptions Index, which is developed by Transparency International. You'll see that that is used as a benchmark, and that there is actually an economic impact that we've determined by where a country is able to reduce its score in the CPI, that there is a net economic benefit of doing so. And that net economic benefit is approximately $38 billion US if a country is able to to improve its score on the CPI. So that cost of not improving your score is significant. And again, you'll see in that report, when you have an opportunity to review it, that there are a lot of important conclusions that can be drawn. And that really takes me to what the 4 recommendations and takeaways are before we move on to my colleague Juliana Fox, who is a vice chair on the IMC with me, and you'll hear from Peter and from Neil as well. So those recommendations that you'll find in this report are as follows, and there are 4 of them. The first one is that if we don't continue to see that the economic cost of not combating corruption If those costs are not continuing to increase, meaning countries need to take action to reduce corruption so that their economies benefit from it, there's a need to monitor progress. And FIDIC is committed to doing so. And we encourage our allies in the fight against corruption to take part in this monitoring and active engagement. Secondly, FIDIC is going to be ensuring that the tools that we provide to all of you are updated and are relevant to the fight against corruption. Coming out of the COVID pandemic, certainly corruption is becoming a bit more insidious, a bit more difficult to smoke out from places where it might be around the world. So we're going to make sure that our tools are relevant and actionable so that you can use them in your work to promote integrity and to fight corruption across your industry. Third, today is the Global Anti-Corruption Day. We want it to be more than just an opportunity to say, hey, there's a problem, let's do something about it. We're advocating using it as a check-in point. And what that means is looking at things that have become successes. Where do we need to cover more ground? Where can we take the opportunity to improve the fight against corruption? And just, again, not simply a check the box or a highlight of the fact that today is an important day in that fight. Finally, we're going to be working to raise the attention of the issue of integrity management, of transparency, and supporting the UN Sustainable Development Goals in the fight against corruption to global leadership, to leaders in organizations, to leaders of the countries around the world that help move humanity forward. And one of the ways we are going to be looking at doing this is through a potential anti-corruption summit. So in summary, the Integrity Management Committee does a number of very important things on behalf of the FIDIC enterprise and the Secretariat in that fight against corruption and holding the line on zero tolerance for corruption globally. We have 3 strategic initiatives. They're executed according to 5 principles within our terms of reference in the committee. And then finally, when you get a chance to look at that report, you'll see that there are some very important findings on economic drivers and how the elimination of corruption improves economies, and then also the 4 recommendations that we are making through that State of the World report to help push this fight forward. So with that, I will turn things back over to Nelson or to Juliana as appropriate.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Richard. That was a very good helicopter view of what the role of the IMC is, which is the priorities and the way we deliver those priorities, which are very, very exciting. Thanks very much. Not only do you talk about the IMC, but you also gave us a very good insight into the report, the finding, and the 4 recommendations. So Juliana, as the deputy, I understand, of the IMC, and also as the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer of WSP Global, this is not just one region, global. I think it'd be good to have your view on the subjects and how you see it from corporate point of view. So Juliana, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, I think we're at a very interesting time in our industry in anti-corruption. First of all, I think we all have to be very proud that we're in an industry and associated with an organization that takes anti-corruption very seriously. We have these types of webinars. We have an integrity management committee that's active. We have various initiatives that go on around the engineering and consulting industry to combat corruption. So I think we should be proud. That being said, we need to have our eyes wide open, and that's notably demonstrated in that poll. And I have to say, I'm shocked, yet at the same time not surprised that 1/3 of people who answered that poll think we're actually doing worse in terms of how corruption is occurring within our industry, and that's quite significant. You know, I think it's really a balancing act, and that's why I say we're in an interesting time. First of all, efforts are being increased, right? Efforts across the board, efforts from governments in terms of the enforcement actions that they're taking, that's increasing. Efforts on the part of our clients in terms of ensuring transparency in the procurement process is increasing. efforts from various anti-corruption initiatives, such as COST, particularly in the infrastructure sector, is increasing. Efforts from the industry perspective is increasing. We have, especially in our industry, we have these various types of initiatives that's going on. We just issued a State of the World report on anti-corruption, so increasing. Efforts on the part of companies is increasing. Right? A lot of companies now have, to some degree, a form of anti-corruption program, and also FIDIC supports that by having a roadmap to implementing an anti-corruption program within different companies of different sizes. So efforts from a corporate perspective, they are increasing, and more we're becoming aware as individuals. So at the individual level, of our individual responsibilities and social responsibility to report if we see something that's happening. So you see all across the board, from government to various different anti-corruption initiatives, to industry associations, to corporate initiatives, to individual responsibility, all of those efforts are increasing to combat corruption. At the same time, we're in a very interesting point in terms of the risks of corruption. And I say that notably because come out of a pandemic, there's a large amount of money being invested in infrastructure. In addition, we're moving towards sustainability, low carbon offset infrastructure projects. So there's a lot of investment in infrastructure going on right now in a very short period of time. According to a recent McKinsey survey, over the next few years, there's going to be $1 trillion to $3.5 trillion that should be invested in green infrastructure in order to meet sustainability goals. That's a massive amount of money, and sustainability goals have timelines, right? It's going to be invested in a very short period of time. So because of this, there's an environment right now that's being created where corruption risks are increasing. So again, we're talking about a balancing act. While efforts are increasing to combat it, there's corruption risks that are also increasing at the same time. And what is the impact of all of these corruption risks, right? Well, we've seen it in the State of the World report. So as Richard noted in the State of the World report on corruption that was just issued today, we've seen that that increasing efforts against corruption, reducing corruption, actually has a benefit on GDP, right? But if you flip that on its head, right, the cost of not reducing corruption has never been higher. So the cost of not reducing corruption from a GDP perspective is very high. The cost of not reducing corruption from a human rights perspective is also increasing. And you see there's a correlation between human rights risks and corruption risks across the board. The cost of not reducing corruption now from a climate change and climate action perspective is also increasing because of that environment that's being created where there's higher, well, we're creating risks in terms of green investment and green infrastructure. So again, it's a really interesting time. And I think we saw that in the results of the survey, where a third of us on this poll said, actually, you know what? Corruption is getting worse within our industry as opposed to better. And I think that's one of the very interesting things that we should continue talking about going forward, is these increased risks at the same time as these increased efforts that are putting into place, and how do we shape those efforts in order to make them evolve with the risk environment that we're currently dealing with. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliana. Thank you for that. That was very, very useful. I think the point you raised is that we live in an interesting time where everybody's doing their best. Both the government, the client, the industry, the company, FIDIC, individual are making efforts to see progress and eradication of corruption. But yet we also see the risk of not doing enough. And what you said there is a balancing act that we need to continue to work on. because these have impact on human rights, have impact on climate change, and also have impact on GDP, which is really good. Now, I'm going to invite Peter Matthews as the Executive Director of Infrastructure Transparency Initiative, COSI, which FIDIC signed a collaboration with, and is also the CEO of Engineers Against Poverty. I've known Peter for a long time, and I think your cause is that we sound as if we are not making progress, but we are making progress. And as Juliana said, one third of those who are involved in the survey still feel is getting worse. So Peter, the floor is yours. Can you share your thought on the subject?
Well, thank you very much for that that kind introduction, Nelson, and for inviting me to be part of this important event today. I mean, already we've just started. It's an interesting conversation looking at the results of the poll, and I was interested in Juliana's reaction to that. So I'm hoping we'll get a chance to go into that when we engage with the audience to today's event. Just going back for a moment, I had an opportunity to review the State of the World report that was referenced by Richard in his opening remarks. It really is a very rigorous piece of work. It draws interesting conclusions, and it makes recommendations that should be widely supported. So just to echo what Richard said, do go and have a look at the report. The conclusions, the recommendations, really important. So I recommend it. Now, FIDIC has established itself as a leading voice on anti-corruption and good governance. And the power and legitimacy of that voice should not be underestimated. These are remarkable figures. FIDIC represents 1 million engineering professionals and 40,000 firms in more than 100 countries worldwide. And in putting its considerable weight behind efforts to tackle corruption, FIDIC is a formidable force for good in this area, and it deserves recognition for the work that it does. Now, launching the report on International Anti-Corruption Day is obviously very fitting. This day provides an opportunity to reflect on progress, share experiences, reconfirm our commitment. I like what Richard said about making this annual day a check-in point. It's about accountability, I think. So next year, I'm hoping that we'll be reflecting on the report and the progress that has been made in the last 12 months in terms of implementing the recommendations. So I think this day is also an opportunity to give recognition to all those around the world in the private sector, in government, and in civil society who dedicate themselves to tackling corruption. There is no doubt that corruption exists in every country, but in my experience, it's also the case that there are individuals and institutions in every country who are working selflessly and often at great risk to themselves to fight against it. They're courageous and principled, and we really owe them a debt of gratitude and should be reflecting on their contribution on this important day. Now, I don't think it's necessary at an event organized by FIDIC to make the case for how important infrastructure is. But I do want to suggest that we are at a point in history where it's probably more important than ever. That's because the global challenges that we face, and including that the climate emergency, recovering from the pandemic, meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, and the threat of global recession that's looming in the next 12 months, they all require more and better quality infrastructure if we are to meet them. So delivering infrastructure isn't just about strengthening economies and improving lives, as important as those things are. It's also about our very existence. And reducing and eliminating corruption will accelerate our efforts to tackle those global challenges. And I want to briefly mention how recent technological developments can assist in that challenge. New technologies are transforming how infrastructure and services are delivered. Now, many in this event will be better versed than me in those technologies, but they include digital twins, 3D printing, cloud and data storage, vehicle-to-vehicle communication, and many more. These developments are referred to collectively as infratech. And in 2020, under the Saudi leadership of the G20, the G20 published the Riyadh Infratech Agenda to amplify the opportunities that they present. So if you haven't seen that, I would seek out that document. It's a fantastic introduction, and it amplifies some of the opportunities related to this infratech agenda. So these technological advances must also be applied to anti-corruption and good governance. It's important that they're not left out of this picture. Cost and others are demonstrating how data standards, disclosure portals, data analytic platforms, and other approaches can improve transparency and accountability, reduce corruption, save public money, and importantly, improve the quality of infrastructure and services that companies, individuals, families, that we all rely on. So this is my message on International Anti-Corruption Day. I welcome the leadership shown by FIDIC, and in particular, the report that has been published today. Tackling corruption is now more urgent than ever, and as we work together to deliver infrastructure needed to tackle a set of complex and interrelated global challenges. And Infratech has enormous potential to accelerate these efforts. I'll pause there and hand back to you, Nelson. I look forward to hearing the other panelists and the questions from their chat.
Thanks very much, Peter, for that. You know, the key message for me there is the new word of Infratech. Recognizing the role of FIDIC, that's so kind of you to make such a good positive word. We have no choice in FIDIC if we represent 1 million people and who are professional, who are involved at the cutting edge of delivering infrastructure right from the onset of scoping the project all the way to the asset management or even selling the assets on. We are heavily involved. If it's not in the design or helping the client to decide, do you need an asset or not asset? To the extent where the pension for that buying in, our members are heavily involved. So you are absolutely spot on by saying FIDIC is taking a leadership role there. And I do welcome the point you raised that, you know, we're at a point of influence where the role of, you know, infrastructure is becoming more and more critical to bail ourselves out of the recession that is being planned or coming through, and the issue about meeting the SDG goal. You are spot on that. So the technology challenges, I take that on board. Now, I'm going to invite Niels Tangbray, who is the co-founder and director of Global Infrastructure Anti-Corruption Center, to share with us his thought on the subject. Now, let me just let out a little bit. Neil and I have known each other for over 20 years. We've been on this battle for a long time, and we are both aging wisely on the subject, and both of us are looking extremely young. So Neil will share with you very quickly his thought on the subject before we open it up. Neil, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nelson. And as you say, we've gone back a long time together and fought together on many anti-corruption initiatives, and I hope slightly successfully in all cases. Thank you very much to FIDIC for inviting me to be on this very important panel on this very significant day of the 20th anniversary of the UN Convention Against Corruption. And I must applaud FIDIC, you know, unreservedly for your continuous leadership in the infrastructure sector and engineering sectors of the anti-corruption agenda. You have been sort of aspiring to fight corruption all the way through the last 20 years. Initially, you were a lone voice in the sector to a large degree, and now thankfully have been joined by others. But FIDIC has always been right at the forefront of the fight against corruption with your tools and your leadership and your advocacy. So you are to be congratulated and applauded for that. And I think in producing this very important report, which shows very significant findings, it's also very interesting to see your connection between a reduction in corruption and a growth in GDP and all the other indicators that you find. To me, this is not a surprise because increasingly now economists are agreeing that corruption is damaging to the world's development, damaging to people, damaging to economies, damaging to countries. So the findings in your reports, in my view, are not a surprise, and they add to the increasing weight, showing the importance of corruption to growth and well-being. But it's worth reflecting in 2022 that it was not always like this. If you go back even only 40 years, when I first joined the industry, everything was the other way around. I think the economic arguments were probably in favor of corruption in many respects. I think many economists would look at countries and say, there's a higher perceived corruption in that country, but there's also higher economic growth. Therefore, corruption is a useful economic oil for growth. And there was a lot of argument that actually corruption was necessary and beneficial for economic growth. And these arguments pervaded all the way through the 1980s and 1990s. It was probably only in the late 2000s and much more recently that economic thinking has centered around the fact that corruption is damaging. It's also useful to reflect on the inverted anti-corruption programs we had. When I first worked in the industry in the early 1980s, I think it's fair to say that a large majority of exporting companies in most exporting countries would routinely pay bribes wherever they were working, and that these bribes were normal and expected and simply added to the contract price. Once you'd priced up the works, added your overhead and profit, you added a bribe of 25–30% on top. It was routinely done, understood by all executives, supported by governments, supported by development agencies. It was just part of the normal business in the 1980s and 1990s. And also due diligence was inverted from what it is now. Nowadays, in good corporate practice, due diligence on agents and subcontractors is normally to try and show that they are not corrupt. They will be honest. They will not pay bribes on your behalf and for your benefit. But it's fair to say, going back 40 years, due diligence on agents was to identify the most corrupt agents. You wanted to find an agent who would pay a bribe and who would divert the money to the most appropriate government minister to guarantee you the work. So in the space of 40 years, we've flipped entirely an argument where corporate management processes integrated corruption as a core part and routine part of the business, to now where it's expected that organizations will root out corruption and avoid corruption as a routine part of their management, and where we've inverted the economic argument to where corruption is perceived as being beneficial to economic growth, to now where it's seen universally as being adverse to economic growth. And that's a fantastic development. And the fact that we have changed this perception and actuality on its head is due to a number of factors, one of which is civil society activism, which has actually led international lawmakers to need to take action because activists have persuaded them of the need. Another indicator is economists who have changed the economic argument to show the need for preventing corruption. Another has been the valuable leadership of organizations such as FIDIC, who've said enough is enough. We are not going to tolerate corruption. We must root it out. But critically also, the prisoner's dilemma. You can't stop corruption on the supply side or the demand side, effectively, unless you change the law and make sure that the legal environment in all countries prohibits corruption. And that's what the UN Convention effectively did. It dismissed any argument that there are differences in countries, in law, in practice, and culture. It universally agreed that corruption was wrong, must be criminalized, must be rooted out, must be prosecuted, and compelled countries to work together to eliminate it. So the UN Convention turned the legal background on its head. And that, on that basis, we have built all the last 20 years of development. And now what do we see today? We see a world where corporations are expected to implement anti-corruption programs, such as the FIDIC Integrity Management System, or ISO 37001, or other good practice mechanisms. Companies are expected to put these practices into place. And there's a lot of reports in newspapers reporting on corruption, showing up what's really happening. For example, in the UK at the moment, where The Guardian has identified huge corruption in the UK government during the pandemic, where the UK government tore up all procurement good practice and placed billions of pounds of contracts with donors to the Conservative Party. This has been shown by good journalism. We wait to see whether good prosecution will do anything about it. But anyway, we are in a world now where it has changed, it's inverted. We're now in a world of anti-corruption. We acknowledge corruption is bad and we must stop it. And this is a wonderful transformation. But as we've all pointed out, and as your survey shows, we're a long way from getting to the end game. We have to continue fighting. We're on the right trajectory, but every individual, every corporation must now say, enough is enough. We personally are not going to pay a bribe. We're not going to let our corporation pay bribes. We're going to put procedures into place to stop bribes being paid. And if bribes are found, we're going to deal with them. We're going to report them. We're going to prosecute them. So we can get there. It's a longer journey than many of us had hoped, but we've made rapid progress, so we can be optimistic. So again, I applaud FIDIC and the leadership of Nelson for your role in the fight against corruption. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neil, for taking us back 40 years and then bring us forward into where we are. And I think if I were to sum that up with saying, notwithstanding 30% that said the situation is getting worse, we've actually made a really, really good progress over the years. But as Juliana said, that is not good enough. That is not good enough. That's what I hear from Juliana. And now a lot has been said by our 3-4 speakers. I'm just going to put one question each to each of the speakers before I open the conversation to the participants who are really putting questions in the chat room. Please keep it coming. We'll look at that in a minute. And rest assured I'll come to you. But I think it's important if you just open the conversation up. So perhaps, if you just have the image of all the speakers, that'd be helpful. Now, I heard, Richard took us through the role of the IMC, took us through the recommendation and the way the IMC work, which is brilliant. Gillian said 30% is still not good enough. She's looking for a zero tolerance. I get that. And I also hear, Peter saying we are making progress and there are a number of initiatives by different organizations, different institutions, and Neil then close out to say we still have some room to go. So let me start off on the basic level. Richard, from your standpoint of the tools are there, we have commitment to keep working on the tools to make sure the tools are relevant. But what can individual do? Because the individual makes up the organization, make the institution and all of that. What can an individual do on this concept? Because it's so fundamental, because sometimes we wrap things around company, organization, institution, and it's okay for Neil to say, Nelson, but FIDIC has been going for 110 years, and this subject of integrity has always been enshrined. So I'm only taking the baton and taking it to the next level. Somebody will go, but what can individual do from your point of view that can shake the world? Richard, back to you.
Great. Nelson, thank you for giving me the opportunity to address this lovely and important question. One thing I would like to do is first direct everybody to the report. My colleague Neil has a wonderful short essay on actions that individuals can take. And his actions that he mentions in the report, not to steal the thunder that you'll find there, are very tactical. So I want to take a look at some actions that you can take strategically coming out of this call or out of this webinar today that will allow us to move the fight against corruption forward. So first, one thing that you can do that's very important is to check your moral and ethical code, your conduct. What are you doing? How do you do your job? How do you act professionally as well as personally? Because separation of the two is not possible anymore. If we are going to be moving things forward in the fight against corruption and you're going to act with integrity, the way you conduct your personal life and the way you conduct your professional life are intertwined, and to a certain extent, they're one and the same. So once you've taken a look at what your moral and ethical code is, identify your red lines. That's the second point I'd suggest. What are the things that you will not do? Where do you know and recognize the lines of corrupt action, the lines where you're moving into things that are unethical or illegal? And if you don't know where those red lines need to be, ask your colleagues, ask your supervisors, ask friends and allies in the fight against corruption to help you draw those lines. It's better to have them in place before you're confronted with an opportunity for corruption than to try to figure it out on the fly. The third thing that I would recommend, and this is something that Neil does talk about in the essay that you'll find in industry comments within our State of the World report, is the importance of expanding your circle of influence with regards to corruption, with fighting corruption in regards to integrity management. You have the opportunity, if you're in a leadership position, to walk the walk of integrity, to show the people who you support as a leader how important this is. You can do the same for your peer group, and you can even manage up the responsibility of acting with integrity, of working towards zero tolerance for corruption, and fighting against this important battle that we have to address in society of corrupt activity. And we can even see that today when you look at the world news, where you had the legislature in Peru stand up to a very potentially corrupt action by the former president. And this resulted in really a victory for transparency, a victory for the rule of law. And these are the types of things that will allow us to continue to move things forward in our sector, in the built infrastructure environment. Nelson, thanks for the opportunity to respond.
Thanks very much, Richard, for that. I'm going to bring Juliana into it, because Juliana, you are the one that really stirred me up by saying 30% is really not good enough. We're looking for 0% of people saying it's getting worse. Now, you are in a corporate environment with a large organization with footprint in different parts of the world, different culture, where this issue about corruption means different things to different people. And surely in managing the ethical standard across the whole of your company, now, because you can take that company and say, well, it is a one company globally and one culture globally, but actually they're operating in different footprints around the world. And as Neil said, in some parts of the world, this used to be standard protocol. You have to build it in, and you have to assume the 25-30% is something you have to pay for an agency. But now you have a bigger operation all over the world. How do you make sure in your process and management system that, as Neil and we've had Richard saying, individuals need to check their own ethical code? How do you make sure you put system in place at a corporate level to make sure everybody in that particular organization are singing from the same hymn sheet?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for the question. And I think what was significant from the poll is, first of all, I think we should try to get to 0, but we'll never probably get there. Because again, it depends. It was a poll based on perception of corruption. And obviously there's very regionalized geopolitical considerations that will always fluctuate across the world. But I was surprised though that a third of the individuals who responded believe that we're trending in the wrong direction. I think that was quite telling. Within organizations, individuals should have expectations that the company implements the right type of culture and controls that allows the mitigation of these types of corruption risks. And by the way, FIDIC has a very good integrity management system document that, quite frankly, gives organizations the roadmap and the key controls that they can use to mitigate the risk of corruption within their organization. From a bird's eye view, because I could talk about this for a very long time, but for a bird's eye view, it always starts with identifying the risks of the company before you can even start talking about the right controls that need to be in place, right? So as an organization, you need to sit down and be very realistic and pragmatic in terms of where your risks are, depending on where in the world you operate, because the risks won't be the same in Latin America, in Africa, in North America, in Europe, and in Asia, and in Australia, New Zealand. They're going to be different in each of those jurisdictions. So where are your risks in terms of the third parties, the business partners you do business with? Where are your risks in terms of the projects you do business with? What are the risks at the project selection phase? What are the risks at the project design phase? What are the risks at the project implementation phase, right? So if you're managing a lot of subcontractors or suppliers, what are your risks in that type of management? And finally, let's not forget, there's also the project audit and monitoring phase where regulators can come in, audit the state of the project, or sign off on a health and safety certification on the project, and there can be corruption that happens there. So know your risks, know your third-party risks, know the risks in terms of the projects you're delivering and where those risks are on that project timeline. Once you have that, then you go into designing the compliance program, and it always starts by culture. always starts by culture. And I think that, people who work in an organization should have a basic expectation that leadership has the right tone, that there are the right training in place. Training is critical. And I know as the IMC in the Integrity Management Committee at FIDIC, we're working on making sure more training is available to individuals on anti-corruption. So culture is always number one. Then comes the controls environment, the policies and controls environment. What are the policies, the key policies in terms of anti-corruption, in terms of whistleblowing? Because let's not forget, one of the number one ways to uncover a misconduct is through whistleblowing and having a strong whistleblowing mechanism in place. So you have the right policies and controls environment within the organization. And again, there are common controls like whistleblowing, and there are also controls that you're going to design depending on the risks that you're dealing with in the organization, such as third-party risk and ensuring you have adequate due diligence, depending on the type of business partner you're engaging in, right? Due diligence for an agent may not be the same as the due diligence for a subcontractor. So it's really important to tailor the controls environment within the organization. And finally, within organizations, it's the auditing and monitoring of those controls. We know across the board, different regulators are now expecting a higher amount of internal monitoring and data analytics to be able to proactively. So again, we don't need, whistleblowing is a key control, but we don't need to wait for someone to raise their hand to catch improper conduct. So how do you as an organization stand behind your data and proactively look into red flags is something that organizations have to more and more make sure that they're able to do that type of data monitoring in order to address issues that could pop up. So from that corporate environment perspective, really number one is to identify risks. And then number two is to make sure that the program is strong on the culture side, strong on the policies and controls side, and then advancing in terms of data analytics and monitoring of the organization. So that's my perspective in terms of the corporate compliance side of combating corruption.
It's exactly what I was expecting you to voice out, and you really hit the core by starting over. So you've got to understand the risk, and that risk cover all facets of the business, from the corporate to the way you deal with third party, and sometimes do due diligence on the client as well, because you need to know where the money is coming from. I mean,
absolutely.
Neil was saying that, it's always on the supply side. What about the demand side? You may choose that this client is a bit corrupt. I don't want to work for them. And you get a bad headline working for the wrong client, you get, in trouble. So I think, from the point of view of the understanding what the risks are and developing policy, and actually the issue about culture and leadership and training, they're all woven into that. And then you close out with the issue about data analytics and actually make sure we're doing an internal control. Absolutely fascinating. I'm going to come to that later on, Juliana, if I can bring on. Now, I want to bring back into my good friend here, Peter, who talked about institution and various organizations doing so many things in there, and they're working, frankly, to make sure that there is. Now, we signed the agreement with COSTE, and that to me is really looking how projects from end to end can become visible, and also to make sure that at least, both the client, the supply chain, everybody are completely transparent. Is that working? And if it's working, what lesson can we learn on that? Because we have Juliana talked about the corporate side, Richard talked about the individual side, but a project actually bring all these things together. Can we learn lesson from that? And what feedback is coming from that cost initiative that we can take on board? Back to you, Peter.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks very much, Nelson, for the opportunity to talk a little bit about COST. COST is a transparency initiative. We're currently working in 20 countries. We work with governments, but we ask governments to form a multi-stakeholder group where they sit down with the private sector and civil society. So the three partners, the three parts of the institutional spectrum working together to oversee that reform process. Our role as the International Secretariat in London is to provide resources, support, develop the tools, be it the data standards, the analytical platforms that really support those efforts that are led by governments and their civil society and private sector partners. One of the really important lessons, Nelson, and I mean, you've mentioned it, the kind of the end-to-end approach, and Juliana talked about the corruption risks at the different stages of the delivery cycle. The approach has to be comprehensive. Sometimes it's necessary to focus on procurement reform, for example, tender management, but ultimately a government, an institution needs to take a comprehensive approach and look at all aspects of the transaction chain. One of my colleagues describes corruption being a little bit like a balloon. And if you focus on one element and you squeeze it, you displace it, you push it into another part of the balloon, it expands elsewhere. So corruption, I think, transparency is one of the kind of fundamental elements of reform. There's a growing body of evidence that it works, that it can deliver practical improvements. The important thing for me about transparency is that it shifts the balance of risk for decision makers. The likelihood that if you get involved in corrupt practice, that it's going to be identified increases dramatically when the environment that you're in is very transparent. When good quality data is available to stakeholders, be that citizens, parliamentarians, the media, when they can access that data and use it to exercise accountability, that shifts the balance of risk for decision makers. A couple of weeks ago, I was in Bangkok. The government of Thailand is one of the countries that work in the cost program. The Ministry of Finance is our partner, and it is introducing the cost reforms. It's been doing it over the last 3 or 4 years. The Minister of Finance has claimed that the program so far has saved $720 million US. That's a very practical saving of public investment. And our understanding of where that comes from is that it shifts the balance of risk. Those projects that are going to be involved in the cost program that are subject to transparency, it just makes the government officials involved and others think twice about doing the wrong thing, about being involved in corrupt practice. So that's a very practical example of where transparency can make savings in public investment. There are other examples where the evidence produced through being transparent through a cost program has been used to close corrupt institutions. Some data coming out of Uganda about 12 months ago, supported by the UK government, where competition has been increasing, where you bring transparency to investments. It provides a positive incentive to the private sector that if they go to all the time and effort involved in bidding for a road contract, for example, it's going to be an open and transparent process, and there's an opportunity for them to win that bid and to get the work. So there are really good examples, Nelson, throughout the world. It's not just cost. I've been talking about that. Lots of other really good reforms that are going on. We know how to tackle corruption better than we ever have before, linking into the discussion that we've got around can you have zero corruption? It's a really interesting, for me, focusing on eliminating corruption. It's about an attitude. It's about saying there isn't a level of corruption that we are willing to live with. It's not a clear objective that you expect to deliver within a certain time frame. That would be unrealistic, but it's an attitude. There isn't a level of corruption that we are prepared to live with. I'll pause there, Nelson, and hand back to you.
Thanks very much, Peter. I think you covered it extensively. I'm not going to bring James in later on. James, can you please, observe what is being said by the panelists, because I'm going to bring you in a little bit, later on. But let me just bring Neil back in. Neil, you talk about flipping the coin 40 years on, and you said we are making progress, and the idea of 25% built into that, and all the issue that people now does on the due diligence actually is eradicating, eliminating, but it's not taking it away. And you close out by actually, shining a light and said, even in UK, that is perceived to be sophisticated, when you have crisis, people take advantage of it. And you look at the COVID, there's so many contracts being let out for friends of politicians. And that's not any different from any developing world. So my take on it is that the word KYC, know your client or know your audience. This is something that I think I heard, Juliana talked about, is do the due diligence. You've been around long enough. How do you think, we can get this message across to what I consider to be first world who think corruption doesn't exist? And then when it does get visible, it's such a big one that it becomes so choking. How do you think we need to deal with that? Because charity begins at home. What's your take on that subject?
Thank you, Nelson. That's a very, very good question, and something very close to our hearts, because actually we feel that the corruption perception index and other measurements of corruption are very unfairly weighted to a certain type of corruption, and therefore they, to a degree, discriminate against developing countries. I think that the corruption perceptions index does not show the true level of corruption in developed countries, such as the USA, the UK, France, and Germany. It's pretty well spoken of that London is the money laundering capital of the world. London is the home of corrupt funds, property developments, properties, bank accounts, etc. There's a huge amount of corrupt money in London. Also, if you go to one of the sort of famous boat marinas worldwide, and you look at the huge super yachts owned by oligarchs, look at the flagging of the super yachts. Most of them are flagged under British overseas territories for tax reasons and secrecy reasons. So nothing seems to pick up this level of corruption in the London financial sector, London property sector. And also, as the UK government has currently shown, the level of corruption currently in the UK government is extremely high. And the sums of money being spoken of, 35, 40, 50 billion pounds worth of COVID money being spent without any proper competitive procurement. And the argument by the UK government is pathetic, frankly. It says it was an emergency and therefore we had to bypass the normal procurement procedures. That is total, absolute rubbish, because as we all know, emergencies do lead to expedited procedures, but they do not lead to the elimination of the procedures. So there would have been plenty of opportunity in the UK for the government to say to all the medical suppliers, we need PPE, please submit tenders within 7 days or something very expedited. But the idea of them going to single source suppliers, for example, the latest scandal involving Michelle Moan's company, is that they actually incorporated their company to supply PPE after they'd put the offer in to supply the PPE. So there was no company in existence. And the UK government placed without competitive tender a £260 million contract with a company which didn't exist previously. It's disgraceful. And the indexes, the CPI and the other index, do not pick up this level of corruption. So I think your question is very apt, Nelson, that charity begins at home and anti-corruption begins at home. And the idea that the USA, France, Germany, Britain are free of corruption and are icons of ethics is absolute rubbish. Corruption is everywhere. And I think there's more corruption in terms of value in the USA, UK, Germany, France than there is anywhere else. And so if you put an index on corruption value, the UK would probably be the most corrupt country in the world, or one of the most corrupt. So I think this is very damaging. This whole perception of corruption takes place overseas, and it leads to an arrogance and an indolence in the governments and the procurement bodies in developed countries. And certainly in the UK, the idea that the Highways Agency in the UK or the HS2 project, the idea that they'd even begin to publish the information that Peter is quite correctly requiring them to publish is a dream. So yeah, this is a hugely taxing point, Nelson, and we need to fight it everywhere unanimously.
There's a lot of questions coming from the floor, but I cannot, escape this, that I do have a past president, Jeff French, online, and I need to acknowledge that. And I think his comment is self-explanatory. He said, having to do things in a hurry increases the risk of corruption. And we saw that with the challenge of COVID, which is the point you just raised. We now have the huge challenge of quickly moving away from the current method of producing energy. That will inevitably increase the risk of corruption. We need to see more corrupt individuals and organizations prosecuted than we have managed so far. So Jeff, I think you summed that up very well. Thank you very much. And that's why you are past president of FIDIC. I suspect we can move the same subject that as we go into Ukraine, where there's going to be a lot of rebuild, as Jeff said, and Neil said, and the need for us to urgently deliver that particular area. We can see more challenges in that area. So there's a number of questions from the floor. We've actually busted our time in the getting together among the panelists. So I'm going to pick up some few questions which is being given to me and to make sure at least we address that. So the first question, as far as I can see, is from Jeremy Mayhew. He said, there is no room for complacency in our industry. Is the message filtering down to the project level? We need war on corruption, but what should be the priorities in this war? So let me bring this back across into James. You are a board member. You've had past presidents saying issue. You've had Neil saying issue. You've also have Richard saying issue. James, what's your take on that? I'm putting that difficult question to you. War.
Thank you.
Corruption. What should we be doing?
Okay. Thank you. Firstly, the war on corruption starts with the individual, no doubt. And I'm actually happy to hear what Neil said, that there has been a transformation in terms of the perception of what corruption is many years ago, where it was viewed as something positive. And I can also give graphic examples of that in the 80s and 90s, and obviously what is happening right now. Wherever somebody is, and especially in an organization like FIDIC, it has to start with ourselves. Even before we engage the external parties, we have to start ourselves. We have to be inward looking in terms of what is it that we're doing, how exposed are we as an organization, as member associations, as project teams, as individuals, etc., and what role can we play in this fight against corruption? The key thing being that there has to be also measurement and monitoring in place to see whether the war is actually being effectively fought and whether progress is actually being made. And secondly, having the capacity and opportunity to look at how it is metamorphosing, how corruption is changing, how sophisticated it is changing, how it is getting hidden, even as we get technology. And one thing I must appreciate is technology, use of technology, reduction of discretion, etc. So it's on all fronts, Dr. Nelson. But I have to also add here the comment of Neil in as far as where the real corruption is and the quantity. I come from a continent called Africa, and sometimes it may sound like that is where the headquarters of corruption might be perceived to be, especially in quantum or perception, etc. But when I heard Neil's comment, which we have suspected, it's just telling us that we can't let our guards down in any country that we're in. Thank you, Nelson.
Thank you, James, for that. There's some background noise on my side. I hope we can try and mitigate that as much as possible. So if I do pause, it's basically to try and avoid the background noise. So we've heard from, Jeff French, and I've heard now from, James saying we need to look inward, ask ourselves the difficult question. Richard, you want to jump in, please, Richard?
Absolutely. I've been very intrigued by a number of the comments that have been coming into the chat, and certainly James, thanks for taking the response on this challenge of how you manage things at the project level. One of the things that I think is very important as we hold ourselves accountable with regard to integrity and fighting corruption is being proactive. Neil, you talked about looking back 40 years and how the perceptions have changed. And and one of the things, Nelson, that I'd like to challenge all of us, not just the panelists on this call, not just the Secretariat, but everybody that's listening in and participating, is being proactive. And there were a couple of comments in the chat about well, where can we do this? How can we do something? Because there's, in some countries, there's almost this overwhelming challenge of working in a corrupt environment. And I'm going to I'm going to put a stake in the ground and say that one of the greatest opportunities that we have not yet taken advantage of is in regards to training, and Juliana talked about this, but it's looking at training our professionals when they enter the sector, when they begin their careers in industry. It's going to be a long-term fight. We've already, Neil, as you mentioned, we've been doing this for 40 years. But if we look at it from a generational process and we start now, not only at the project level, not only at the institutional level, but at the individual level, and we look at the opportunity to train our young professionals in the construction sector and in the built environment sector, in 20 years, they're going to be in positions of leadership. They'll have been brought up to understand and to buy into the concept that corruption is intolerable. There's zero tolerance for it. And they will be acting with integrity at that point in time. So that's one of the things, Nelson, I think we need to kind of, again, drop that stake in the ground and really look to starting to take a proactive and very authoritarian approach to this notion of zero tolerance of corruption.
Richard is saying you start from early pace of people coming into the industry through what we give them as part of their capacity building, to have it enshrined in the process of their learning tool, so that by the time they get to the maturity level, they know this is a gold standard that you cannot walk away from that. Thanks very much for that. A few other questions from the floor. I'm going to try and pick them up. Question from Joe from Racina. How do we deal with situation in which we feel that companies from our sector seems to be comfortable in a bad practice environment? So who wishes to take that question up? Matthew, Peter Matthew, do you want to take that up? How do we deal with a situation in which we feel that the company from our sector seems to be comfortable in a bad business environment? In other words, why are we operating in this sector where we are perceived to be the worst in that, when in fact, there may be other sector, and I think Neil knows where I'm coming from. You take extractive market, and you know that the corruption in that market is actually huge. We take a political market, we've talked about that recently. So why do we actually operate in this sector? Why we're not standing up and saying, this is not allowed, it's not going to happen? Peter, what's your view?
Yeah, thanks, Nelson. I mean, I think Neil, in some of his previous marks, said that in the past, it was part of the operating procedures of some companies. How do we maximize the opportunities that we get? That's much less prevalent now. But there are still some environments that encourage that kind of behavior, that support it. And unfortunately, there are some companies who are willing to exploit it. So what do we do to address it? Obviously, there are a number of different factors. I liked the comment that Jeff French made. There's a risk when you have to deliver quickly. It increases the risks. Major sporting events are another approach that demonstrate that. All the risks are kind of compressed into a much shorter period of time. So what's important, I think, is shifting the behavior of individuals. That includes supporting them, encouraging them, making sure that there is incentives available for them. Jeff's point I wanted to refer to, more people need to be prosecuted. Some of the people on this call, Neil, Nelson, others, were involved in the UK Bribery Act, for example. Many of us fed into that. There is good legislation there. It doesn't mean that there can't be more and better legislation, but I sometimes worry, let's focus and use the legislation that we have. There needs to be more enforcement. There needs to be a price paid for those companies that the questioner identifies who feel comfortable in that kind of environment. Let's progressively reduce the space, give the kind of the negative consequences to that kind of behavior, but also encourage and support those individuals. Reward them, incentivize them, give them the tools that they need. Because although corruption is still a big problem and there's a lot of people involved in it, there are not many people, I don't think, who want to be involved in it when they have an opportunity to get out of those kind of problems.
Thanks very much, Peter. Let me bring Neil back into it. This is perhaps appropriate here. How do organizations like the Global Infrastructure Anti-Corruption Center support those trying to root out corruption? This is, Neil, your street. How do you try to root out that corruption?
Thank you very much, Nelson. What we do, we look at it in all respects, the supply side and the demand side. And we publish on our internet. We're sort of a global resource, effectively. We publish on our internet free of charge resources to help people understand and prevent corruption. So at the first level, we have resources explaining what is corruption, bribery, fraud, cartels, extortion, etc., how it takes place throughout all the phases of the infrastructure project, and how to identify it. So people understand what corruption is. That's the first step. Secondly, we publish anti-corruption programs for governments, for organizations in the sector, and for business associations and professional institutions. So they can unload from our website an anti-corruption program. We then give a lot of guidance to how the program can be implemented and what should be done. And then at an individual level, we also provide training, free online training resources for individual engineers. You can take a short module, which takes you 20 minutes, and get a certificate of completion at the end you can print out. Or you can take a long module, which takes an hour and a half to complete. And again, you get a free certificate of completion at the end. So, and then finally, we are actually developing now, touching on Richard's point, we're developing a university training course, which we hope to publish in the next couple of months, which will be made available to universities and engineering schools worldwide, free of charge, which is intended to be a module which is taught during undergraduate or postgraduate level, which teaches engineering, architecture, and other students how corruption takes place in infrastructure and how to prevent it and what they should do to prevent it. So we hope to let people leave university with a very firm idea that corruption is wrong and what should be done about it. And finally, just one further comment is we also have a checklist on our website for what individuals should do if faced with corruption. We have all the scenarios. What do you do if you're at customs and you ask for a bribe? What do you do if you're at a police checkpoint? What do you do if someone in your company tells you to be corrupt? So we have a number of scenarios which advise people what to do faced with these situations. So we hope to provide a resource to help people, organizations, and governments fight corruption.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Neil, for that. We've got roughly about 10 minutes to go before we wrap up. And one of the things I want to pick up is in Richard's opening remarks, he talks through what the IMC does in terms of the priority and the way they deliver the activity. But actually, towards the end, he goes back into the recommendation of the report and actually asks. So my question is, if we are going to use another anniversary as a checkpoint of our progress, can I then put it across to each and one of you? Any of the 4 recommendations, how do you think FIDIC should work on that diligently? Because if I pick the first one up, it's really about combating and communication and dealing with that. The second one is making sure that we have the tools. If we have the tools, we make sure we keep the tools updated, and we are looking at the tools as a vehicle for helping us to move things forward. And then really the final bit starts about how do we communicate this with the global leaders, because these leaders sometimes are a bit remote for what happened in the grassroots level. So if I'd reverse that process and start with the 4th recommendation, any thought on how we can do that? Because we do have Global Leadership Forum, and there's 100 of them around the world who are members of that, and we meet them 4 times in a year. How can we use this particular message and communicate to them to where there's as value added to their business rather than another noisy boys and girls telling them what we already know? Who wants to give it a kickstart? James or Richard or Neil or Peter? Who wants to give it a kickstart? How do we communicate the message to the great leaders?
I think one thing, Nelson, is that, first of all, FIDIC did an excellent thing by even creating that forum, meaning that you actually bring them together. Because they would have continued in their different groupings, etc. So that platform in itself is extremely powerful. The fact that FIDIC has gone ahead and produced the State of the World Address in Corruption is certainly meaning that FIDIC stand, FIDIC's perception, what FIDIC is doing is available to them. I think what with the conversation has to be continuous. But I think more importantly is to make it a two-way street, which I believe it is, in terms of them telling us how they are progressing, and all the way down, not only at their level, Nelson, because that's what I could get. If we just talk at their own level, then certainly we would be probably missing the point. So also getting some metrics or feedback from them as to whether this is really cascading down, granted that many of them perhaps have good anti-corruption system. That is the first comment that I can make, but I'll turn it over to the rest of the colleagues on the panel.
Thank you very much. I see Juliana, you raised your hand. Juliana, any thoughts on that? How do we use this feedback, to get the leaders in the industry? I'm sure they are fully aware, how do we get them to back it up?
Well, I think the word is communication, and it's the word you used in your question. It's really all about communication. And I think it's actually regrouped also in recommendation 4 to make sure that the theme of anti-corruption is not something yes, Anti-Corruption Day is a key day that we want to think about and make sure is an anchor, but it's not going to be enough. Communication at the beginning of meetings as to the value of integrity, using examples, and this is at the FIDIC level, but it's also all the way down to the corporate level. Talk about it in your meetings. Everybody faces gray zones, and it's important to have those conversations in terms of what type of gray zones we face on a daily basis. If we don't talk about it, we're not going to fix it. So it's about communication on the importance and talking about the different situations that we may face on a daily basis that touches to the theme of business integrity.
Thanks very much, Juliana. That's good. I've got Peter and I've got Richard after that. Peter, do you want to go first, please?
Yeah, thanks, Nelson. A couple of things coming out of the report that I think are really interesting and can help point a way forward. The first one around the day itself. I sense that there's been a kind of a shift in the expectations of this day that I've picked up in the event. Previously, most years I'm involved in some kind of online event, and it's a great opportunity to touch base and to encourage each other. But I like the idea of checking in and being accountable. So that's something that's important for FIDIC and all the other organizations that work with and support FIDIC. But it should be a shift in this day, I think. Let's think about International Anti-Corruption Day as an opportunity to hold ourselves accountable. This is what we've done. These are our achievements. This is where we need to do more. So changing the character of this day, I think. The second one, and I referred to this in my opening remarks, FIDIC has extraordinary convening power and global reach that you have. I know that there's been some discussion around an anti-corruption conference. I've tried to outline why this agenda is so important. If you don't tackle corruption, you're not going to get the investment in the quality infrastructure that's needed to meet the big global challenges that we have. We need an anti-corruption event that's on a level with COP. We really do. It's that important. So let's work with FIDIC, use FIDIC's convening power, bring other partners in, and really ramp up the global discussion on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Richard, your thoughts on the subject?
And I really appreciate the way this conversation is going. And Peter, thanks for your comments, because I've changed what I wanted to talk about based on what you just said. So, looking at those 4 recommendations, and again, the raising the awareness, and Juliana mentioned the importance of communication. One of the things that helps FIDIC, that also helps the IMC do what it does best, is to get feedback from the global community, to get feedback from those of you who are on this call. What are the tools that you need? What are the challenges that you're facing? Certainly we can look at things from a very high level or from a strategic perspective in terms of what we're seeing at, high level indicators or addressing things with global leaders. But a lot of forward motion often comes from people who are on the ground dealing with the challenges on a daily basis. And for those of you who took the time to participate, please give us some feedback. Please let us know where you would like us to help you with your individual fights, because really where we're going to make a lot of progress is at the individuals working together to defeat this challenge of corruption. So, Peter, again, I second everything that you said, and I think it was a really good opportunity to, again, stimulate more discussion and more feedback from everybody who's taken the time to participate today. So, Nelson, back to you.
Thanks very much, Richard. I think we're getting close towards the point now where we need to try and wrap up. Before we do the wrap up, I think it may be a case that we basically take a poll, if I get it right. And the poll is very simple. We've had a lot of discussion. On the basis of today's webinar, are you more or less confident that our industry can take positive steps to address corruption? More confident, less confident? Do you think the discussion we've had today and all the issues and suggestions, including the recommendation of this report, help us that we're more confident that we can address the issue positively? Time to vote. Time to vote. Do we have the result? Are we making the right direction? Juliana said yes. I got 91%. Now, somebody said earlier on that we will never get to a zero situation where we have completely zero tolerance. I think that should be a good aspiration to do. Moving on, that's a good aspiration, but the real thing is, are we really going to get to that stage? But if we get to a point where 91% of those who are involved in today's webinar feel that we are making progress through this conversation, all the changes, let me just give the closing remarks. And it may be a case that, before I close out, if James wished to, I'm quite happy, James, you can butt in before I finish up. But let me start off that, FIDIC was established in 1913. Next year will be 110 years of FIDIC. The concept of quality, sustainability, and integrity has always been enshrined in the FIDIC, what I call values. And it seems to me that, that quality and the values that have been talked about has not moved on. I hear today that there's a huge shift, but we have not eradicated the issue. And what also stunned to me is that in the recommendation, this talks about the finding, and the finding in terms of the impact on the economy, in the finding in terms of the GDP, and also the one conclusion was that there is no clear conclusion as to the impact of corruption on foreign direct investment. To me, I think it's no-brainer. Any country, any investor that wishes to go into a country where there's a lot of corruption will be careful not to actually expose their money there. But it seems to me that the conclusion from the report didn't actually give us a definitive answer. Yes, in terms of the GDP growth, yes, in terms of the ability to have a sustainable, but on the issue of the foreign direct investment has gone through. Now, we had, 4 fantastic speakers. Each and every one of them come on board on different angles. Richard started off by looking through the role of the IMC, and he went through the 3 priorities and the 5 ways of delivering that. Then he focused on the report itself, and then focused on what we consider to be the 4 recommendations, which we touched on. Those recommendations are very much there. We then have Juliana that gave us her perspective, and then in the Q&A session, she talked about how to go through the risk identification all the way to the policy, all the way down to creating, a data and reviewing process. And she said it's all about culture, and it's also about leadership, and it's about policy. But then when we got into the Q&A session, I think the question came through where I got it very much by Richard said, it comes down to individual code of ethics. You as an individual, you need to have a red line. You need to know what it is that you want to promote, what you don't want to promote, and what you want to move into. When we started talking about the role of the companies, we were saying, yes, you can set the process up, but actually the leadership of the company is important. All these institutions are doing a lot in the market, and we need to embrace them and applaud them, but the war is not over. The question is, can we do more? I think the answer is we should be able to do more. Without taking too much time, I just want to wrap up at this point to say thank you very much to our 4 speakers. And I'm going to ask James, if you want to say a quick word, James, before we wrap up. James, do you want to say a quick word? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Nelson, and thank you for your moderation. Let me also thank the panelists that we have had today. I think the key thing that we can see is the power of collaboration, the power of discussion. Today I have learned much, much more, and I think it is a continuous learning experience that we continue to have when we are engaging differently. To hear that these anti-corruption efforts are being made differently, people have different tools, different successes, different stories, both challenging and probably making progress, I think is important. The power of collaboration of FIDIC with other bodies, as displayed with the panelists that we have today here, is certainly demonstrating the power that we have within ourselves to tackle these fights. And with those few words, let me thank all of the panelists, yourself, Nelson, for moderating this, and also the participants. And then finally, wishing you happy holidays. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. Thanks very much on that. Again, I just want to echo that to Richard, to Juliana, to Peter, and to Neil. Thank you very much for your time. The report is out there. Please download it and read through. As you know, it's been said, please give us feedback. We need feedback on it. Going forward, we do have one more webinar before the end of the year on the 13th of December, where we are looking at the issue about international financial institution, in looking at all the issues that goes with working in a difficult zone. There will be another State of the World report on the 9th of February, 2023. And then, of course, we have our usual contract users conference online in May and also in person in 2023 November. Moving forward, of course, we had a fantastic conference in Geneva this year. The date for next year conference already been set, and the venue is going to be Singapore. So the website is already open. So please do plug in and register. On this note, I'm going to say massive thank you to everybody, to all our panelists, to the participants, to the FIDIC staff behind the scene who makes me look much better than I am. Thank you very much for your time, and let's continue to celebrate, this Anti-Corruption Day. And hopefully next year we have an opportunity, as we said, to keep checking on progress and to report back. Thank you very much. Wherever you are, please say, take care. God bless.